Okay,
All yours.
all right. Thank you everyone for being here. I mentioned to Chris before that I didn't expect to be defending my thesis from my kitchen in Sweden, but then again, it is what it is. So yeah, let's do this thing. I'm just gonna share my screen with you all. Can someone give a thumbs up so that I know that everyone can see that? And then now it's full screen, right? All right, perfect. So, as said, my thesis is on supervised machine learning, as most of you already know. And we currently live in a time where technological advancement is made on the daily. And with that comes capabilities that previously were unprecedented. Nonetheless, these capabilities do not come without repercussions, which we're about to explore. But first, some may wonder what exactly is machine learning. Machine learning is the ability for computers, through analysis of extensive data sets, to find trends and make predictions using statistical models. It is the foundation of how many artificial intelligence applications learn, find patterns in data, and predict outcomes based on previous subjects. And there are many types and techniques of machine learning, but the one this thesis focused on was supervised learning. And all that means is that there are labels applied to the data, and a common application is, for instance, looking at variables that contribute to cancer and predict the best suited treatment for a patient. The label would then be the recommended treatment for that patient, which based on its success or failure could help the machine learning model refine its decisions for future subjects. And so in short, machine learning makes use of statistical evidence to back up certain claims and or conclusions. And in doing so, it makes use of inductive reasoning. And as philosopher C.D. Broad stated, induction is the glory of science and the scandal of philosophy. Why? Because when you generalize the conclusions of previous data onto future subjects, you will inevitably make mistakes. Otherwise, machine learning would be the fail-safe way of predicting the future, which it clearly isn't, as we can see how short it falls, when predicting the stock market, for instance. And so this gives rise to bias in machine learning, which is what this thesis has hoped to address. And so bias in machine learning is often split into two categories: data set bias and algorithmic bias. Data set bias is when you fail to create data sets that properly reflect the reality of a situation. And this has become very evident in facial recognition applications, for instance, where in 2018, a study called Gender Shades showed that even though Microsoft's application had 94% accuracy in classifying the gender of respective subjects based on their faces, 93.6% of all mistakes that were made involved brown or black people. For IBM, on the other hand, 96% of all misclassifications involved women. So these are huge margins. And so one of the reasons behind these disparities is that a lot of the data sets that are used in these contexts are overrepresenting men and lighter skinned subjects. IGBA, which is a data set commonly used by governmental bodies, has 75% male and 79% light skin representation, and that will inevitably have an impact on the resulting model. So yeah, basically what we can draw from this is that machine learning models can't learn what they can't see. And there are many types of data set bias, but this is one of them and probably the most common one. Algorithmic bias, on the other hand, is a more general concept which involves everything from choices made in implementing a specific algorithm to what output that we consider to be acceptable. Nonetheless, both of these have the same source: our cognitive biases and how they affect our stances on certain issues. How much can a machine learning model discriminate and still be acceptable? How lenient can we be in our requirements on data collection? How much empirical research do we need before including a feature in our data set? How confident are we that the chosen learning algorithm is the best suited one? Do we understand that the algorithm, do we understand the algorithm well enough to know how it arrives at decisions? And yeah, these are all questions that must be answered every time a machine learning model is deployed. And oftentimes we fail to answer all or even most of them correctly. Why? Because we have different definitions of what is fair, reasonable, just, what have you. In the end, the biases in our models derive from our implicit biases, which in turn derive from our diversity of thought, respective incentives, and we'll talk about incentives toward the end. But we are seeing a lot of improvements in performance and the mitigation of bias. I'm not going to lie about that. The same gender classification audit was made a year later by Gender Shades. And Microsoft, for instance, which had a 20.8% difference in performance between darker females and lighter males, brought that same number down to 1.5% a year later. We're also seeing developments in reducing the bias of models, even with bad data sets. But as we witness improvements, major problems remain, obviously. In the second audit, Gender Shades also chose to include two newer facial recognition models made by Kairos and Amazon, respectively. And Amazon clearly had the worst performance of all audited models, with a 31.4% performance difference between darker females and lighter males. That's a common measure in the field. Yet for some reason, Amazon found it convenient to pitch their software to ICE for use in their operations. And this either means that Amazon didn't check for these biases, which would imply serious negligence, or that they simply don't care about people getting unjust arrests and deportations. These are the biases as well as the incentives that I was hoping to address as part of this thesis. So much of the research that's being performed on mitigating bias in machine learning focuses on how and when it should be implemented. But we rarely ask whether machine learning should be used in certain contexts at all. It is not until we answer the question of if we should implement a solution using machine learning that we can answer the questions of how and when. And this thesis simply attempted to address the missing piece of the puzzle by developing a flowchart form framework, which we'll see later, that allows us to get an idea of whether the given context, task, and model warrant the implementation of machine learning. And essentially, it's supposed to theoretically optimize our conditions, but allow human beings through collaboration and discussion to fill in the gaps. And so, how did we come up with this? Well, considering that it's the first of its kind framework, it required a bunch of inspiration from works of prominent philosophers in the realms of justice, fairness, liberalism, what have you, but also some contemplation of my own to build a framework from the bottom up. Obviously, trial and error was an integral part of it, as multiple approaches were tried and scrapped before coming up with the current one, and Noreen could certainly attest to that. And so what did we come up with? Well, to begin with, I wanted to outline the components of the framework, which will be addressed in the coming slides, but they're distributive justice, compensatory justice, freedom of choice, interpretable versus explainable machine learning, and accountability. And for the framework to have the desired impact, we need answers to three questions. One, the task we wish to solve. Two, the model that we hope to use to solve the problem. And three, the context in which we wish to implement the model. The framework then returns a recommendation on whether implementation should occur and what potential measures that should be taken to do so justly. So as we saw with, when discussing gender classification with Gender Shades, the most prevalent issue in machine learning is how mistakes are distributed and that some groups are disproportionately punished by this. Since our cognitive biases play into what we think is fair for each group, we started looking at theoretical or deontological ways of defining what is fair for everyone. And for this purpose, John Rawls' Justice as Fairness is a great tool in which he tries to distance us from our biases to the extent that is possible, using a thought experiment called the original position. The original position is basically what Rawls claims to be our collective stance, assuming that we know nothing about ourselves or the people that we share our societies with. And what he arrived at was that everyone is entitled to equal basic rights and liberties, and that everyone should have fair equality of opportunity. And these may be obvious, but that's what he arrived at. But he also arrived at the conclusion that if inequality of opportunity is inevitable, that such inequality should favor the least advantaged in the context. Like everything else, his approach isn't perfect, but it is one of few attempts to take a deontological approach to this problem and apply it in practice. And so that difference principle that I outlined at the end is also an example of what we call compensatory justice, which is exactly what it sounds like, properly compensating for shortcomings in other accommodations of justice. Now, what does that look like for machine learning? One of the relevant cases is a program that was used in Indiana to make decisions on welfare distribution and how it resulted in, frankly, terrible outcomes. One specific case that gained attention was that of Omega Young, who in late 2008 had her benefits revoked for not having booked an appointment due to her being in the hospital getting treated for cancer. And so this automated system interpreted this as a failure to cooperate, and Young died less than a year later due to her disease complications. And so in this case, the system generalized its decision-making based on the assumption that most people who fail to book an appointment do not have a good enough reason to do so. Omega Young was simply an unperceived outlier who had done nothing wrong and still got punished. And so compensatory justice ensures that we properly detect these anomalies and that the associated individuals don't get unjustly punished. Now, since this framework is just trying to optimize the mitigation of bias from a theoretical standpoint, we also need to make sure that it can be carried out in practice. And obviously, questions like those of Omega Young or solutions to those are very difficult to find. And unless we have tools to deal with it, we will inevitably have problems. And that's where moral evaluation comes in, which allows us to consider how to best assess our stances with as little bias interference as possible. 18th century economist and philosopher Adam Smith posed the claim that theoretically, the best entity to determine a proper course of action would be an impartial spectator, which consciously distances one from all the biases that affect judgment. And this may be something obvious, but clearly not obvious enough for us to apply frequently. And what's good about this is that some of the leading thinkers of the computer science field have recognized this as basically the best approach and started an industry around it called algorithmic auditing. Algorithmic auditing is basically what it sounds like. It's an actual impartial spectator deployed to assess the impact of certain applications and the associated fairness of that impact. Cathy O'Neill, who wrote the well-known book Weapons of Math Destruction, has now started an algorithmic auditing firm, which makes use of moral evaluation tools to get the job done. One of which is what we call an ethical matrix, and I've drawn one up here. The gist of it is that in collaboration with the groups getting impacted by the application, they go through the optimal outcomes for three variables, well-being, autonomy, and justice, for each of those groups and try to ensure that all of those requirements are fulfilled. The creators of the matrix also intentionally aligned some of its justice objectives with those of John Rawls, which works really well with what we outlined in the distributive justice portion of the framework. So these are just mere suggestions on moral evaluation. There are other approaches to it, but I think the one we outlined here is appropriate for our ambitions. Now, assume that a certain application doesn't fulfill the requirements of distributive justice or compensatory justice, or even both. There are still situations in which some individuals would choose to expose themselves to such injustice because of other priorities. For instance, if a cancer patient is told that there is a machine learning assessment tool that discriminates in performance against minorities, but that still performs much better than any physician's diagnosis, one may still want to consider it. It becomes a question of whether one wants to forego the importance of distributive and compensatory justice for the sake of contextual performance, if you may. This would obviously not be an easy decision to make, as one may possibly trust the physician more than any statistical advantage that machine learning could give, but that's the point. The decision should not be made for the subject, it should be made by the subject. And so for the purpose of this framework, there are two questions that are related to freedom of choice that we want to consider. The first one is whether we can avoid a task altogether. In other words, will we die if we don't complete this task? And for this, we use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you can find on the right, and said that with some minor changes, the bottom two steps of the pyramid, the physiological and safety needs, could be considered subjects for which related tasks would be absolutely necessary to get through, that you'd actually die if you wouldn't. And the second one, are there non-machine learning alternatives to opt for? And the reason we ask for non-machine learning alternatives is because this framework makes a distinction between the freedom of choice and the freedom of informed choice. Most people don't even understand simple machine learning, which makes one ask, have you really chosen to subject yourself to something if you don't understand what that something is? This is where the ideas of interpretability and explainability come into play. Interpretability in machine learning is when an algorithm is understandable and intuitive without full expertise on the topic, whereas explainable machine learning, also called black box machine learning, is when a model's algorithm and data set are so large and complicated that we need additional measures, such as summary program, to explain how they actually work. First of all, if there are multiple solutions to one problem, choose the easiest one. And that's exactly what Occam's razor points out. And frankly, it makes no sense beyond the profitability of black box algorithms for companies to do otherwise. Second, yes, there are instances in which we don't need to be informed about our choice. In fact, we sacrifice that understanding for performance when we opt for black box algorithms. But in some instances, say a court case, the rationale behind an action has a serious impact on the resulting decision. Otherwise, manslaughter and murder would be pretty much the same thing, according to our criminal justice systems, which they're obviously not. And so, for the same reason, if we prioritize rationale before performance, we also need to be careful with how we use black box models, as we simply don't understand their rationale fully. And this is why Compass, which was a machine learning program developed to aid judges in sentencing decisions, received harsh criticism in 2016 and was scrapped as a result. It just wasn't appropriate for the task at hand. And so this is what we arrive at. After considering all relevant components, we arrive at this flowchart, which is a combination of everything we discussed in earlier slides. Now you'll notice that at the end of each branch, we also see accountability, which I haven't talked about yet, so let's do that real quick. Accountability is making sure that developers or non-personal users are held responsible for mistakes. Developing good machine learning models is a trial and error type of deal, and they will never be perfect, as we pointed out in the beginning. That's why this framework even recommends honest implementation of models that don't fulfill the requirements of distributive and compensatory justice, but recommends that this practice of honest improvement continues after implementation. Nonetheless, there should be a difference between those who make mistakes in machine learning by accident, and those who do so knowingly. That's the difference between restorative justice, which focuses on fixing mistakes in collaboration with victims and those impacted, and criminal justice, which focuses on appropriate punishment for wrongdoing. Now, how do we assess what is negligence? Well, that is mainly defined by your approach to moral evaluation. For instance, if you use an ethical matrix in your evaluation, anything that was included in that ethical matrix should be accommodated for, and if it isn't, that was negligence. There are other approaches, obviously, but nonetheless, negligence in the context must be defined for this to work. And so let's go through two examples to see how this would play out. I've chosen one real life example to actually go through the flowchart, and one for further consideration of how complicated something like this could get. And the first thing I want to apply this framework to is Facebook. They're known for mishandling people's data, with which the Cambridge Analytica scandal emphasized, but they're also known to discriminate by exposing ads to people based on protected variables, such as race. So let's see how Facebook fares in our framework. Let's see, I've never used this annotation stuff on Zoom before, but okay, let's start at the top. Is Facebook a life-defining need? No, you won't die without social media. You may think that you will, but you won't. Is it a black box model? Or, excuse me, I skipped a step. Do we have non-machine learning alternatives? Well, one could argue that you can socialize without machine learning, but all machine learning, well, all social media apps also include machine learning. So it's kind of a yes or no type of deal there. But nonetheless, we can proceed to the next step. Is it a black box model? Absolutely. They use thousands of variables and they don't have any, interpretability. And so, yeah, obviously it's a black box model. Is it a first task attempt? No, we've seen social media before. Are there interpretable models with similar performance? Well, this is kind of tricky because you would have to define what performance for a social media app is, but unless it's an unequivocal yes for this is something that we could proceed to the next step with. Do they fulfill the requirements of distributive and compensatory justice? Based on what we said before, probably no. And so we move down here. And last but not least, are they held accountable for potential mistakes that they make? And by my personal assessment, I'd say no. Now, some may disagree, but by my personal assessment, in combination with this framework, Facebook in its current form shouldn't be allowed implementation. Now, let's say that we disagree with that and we say, no, they're held accountable. Well, in that case, because of the fact that they didn't fulfill the requirements of distributive and compensatory justice, they should still be transparent about what the mistakes are in their algorithms. And so this recommends an implementation with full disclosure on what those mistakes could be. So if we clear all of these and move to the next example. So this is more of a hypothetical example, facial recognition to gain access to something. Well, the first thing is, well, access to what? So let's try some things. Let's assume that it's for door access at work. Is that a life-defining need, which is the first requirement of the framework? Well, opening the door may not be, but if that's what's required for you to carry out your work, which gets you the money to stay alive, could it be defined as a life-defining need? You tell me, I don't know. It's a difficult question. Now, let's assume we want access to our phones. Is that a life-defining need? Can we survive without phones nowadays since everything is done on them? Once again, I don't know. These are not easy questions, and for that reason, it is important that when we put this flowchart to work, that we have elaborate answers to all the required inputs to the framework and are willing to discuss them. Otherwise, the output simply won't be as direct as desired. So yeah, there's that. All right. Although I'm very proud of what has been accomplished by this thesis, I do realize that it's not an end-all be-all. It is more than possible that there are other thoughts, philosophical theories that could contribute to this framework, either by replacing certain parts of it or adding substance to the current structure. Nonetheless, there are, also practical issues to consider. I should note first. Currently, there are many incentives beyond improving the human condition to deploy machine learning. It saves time, it saves money, it saves accountability, and our laws and economies encourage us to prioritize these above the human condition at times. And let me give you an example. For a company, collecting diverse data is more expensive than to use currently available data sets. And so in their view, they can argue that despite some of what they consider to be minor flaws of their models, it's not fair for them to have to spend a large amount of money to accommodate a relatively small group of people. In fact, if a CEO doesn't try to find significantly cheaper solutions to improve the bottom line, the probability of them getting fired goes through the roof. Nonetheless, an individual who is part of such an impacted group may and probably should think differently about it. And so to avoid these, what I consider to be wrong incentives, components of the framework are going to require legal inaction. And luckily, we've seen some of that with the European Union implementing the GDPR and Congress with the Algorithmic Accountability Act. But also, if the incentives of companies were aligned with those people, many of our problems in this area would disappear. And so I hope to see more research targeting human-centered economies and laws in the future. As with everything else, this thesis is not perfect by any means, but it's a first. The main importance was to develop considerations that had a common thread of logic without making the framework overwhelmingly technical. This work is intended for anyone affected by machine learning, either as an impactor or impacted. And today, frankly, that is essentially everyone. And so for this reason, it was important to develop guidelines that are, to a large extent, understandable to most or all human beings. I believe personally that this work has succeeded in that regard, and that with additional constructive feedback could help spur discussion about a field that frankly needs way more serious consideration in the near future. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bardia. Good job.
Thank you.
So let's unmute the committee. And the first stab at asking Bardia questions goes to his committee. So any of you who have a question or comment, a thought? Bardia, maybe, Melissa, I'm not sure. If your questions might need Bardia's PowerPoint, maybe we should leave the screen sharing up for a wee bit.
That's what I was wondering, but I can leave it up for now.
I can still see Bardia on video, so I think
Okay.
it'll be okay, as long as everyone else can.
Should be okay then, in case somebody wants to see one of the slides again.
So I don't know how you'd like to organize who asks questions. I mean, I have about 100 questions, but I think I'd probably get run out of here if I asked that many. So
why don't you get us started, Peter?
Start it off. Okay. So thank you, Bardia. I mean, this work was really fantastic. I really thoroughly enjoyed reading the document, and I mean that. It was really a joy to read. I think it's clear you put a lot of time into it. You were touching on a lot of different fields, many of them personal loves of mine too. So it was really just a joy to read, see a lot of this come together. So thank you.
That means a lot.
That wasn't a question, but that's where I wanted to start. But so I have a bunch of questions. I'll start with, I think, the most burning one for me, which is you kind of ended talking about accountability. And sure. I think that's a really interesting topic to talk about, because the ability for someone building a machine learning system to be accountable also sort of varies.
Right.
So what I'm thinking about here is, the big players in the industry, right? Amazon, Google. It's clear that they may not be doing their part in being accountable for what they build, right? And I think a lot of what you're talking about here is meant to address that issue, which is very important.
Yep.
I also have some concerns about whether machine learning would become something only for the big players in the industry, right? So I think, Amazon's not going to go under if one of their machine learning systems gets thrown out because it doesn't meet your standards.
Right.
But, Jane's machine learning shop, if there ever becomes such a thing, some small business maybe couldn't. And I wonder if that's an equitability issue. And I wonder what you think about that and maybe what the future will look like for machine learning with that under consideration.
So I think that's a really good point, actually. And I've thought about it consciously in the sense that I've been trying to construct a framework that accommodates the practical limitations we have in implementing it. And one of them is the fact that, first of all, these are, regardless of whether we're looking at the big companies or the smaller companies, these are very, very difficult questions to answer. Like, I can't put my foot down and say that, they fulfill the requirements of distributive and compensatory justice. And so in that sense, I've basically been saying that that's why I also called it a consideration rather than a requirement. It's more, this is something that people should consciously be thinking about in implementing their algorithms and implementing their solutions, but that it could also go either way. So like if we're considering a smaller company that doesn't have the ability to implement solutions on such a large scale and, frankly doesn't impact a lot of people, if the people within that organization are fine with the way it's doing it, be my guest. And so the main thing that I wanted to address with the flow chart was some tasks we should be more careful about implementing using machine learning. And that's why we didn't get to the left branch of this, the ones that, address the life-defining needs that are the way I defined them. But as you can see there is that, if it's a black box model, you can't implement it. If they don't, fulfill the requirements of distributive and compensatory justice, you can't implement it. Whereas we have way more flexibility on the right side of things. And so it's basically just making the distinction that some parts or some tasks are simply not meant for machine learning, and that we should be very, very careful about implementing them, especially on a large scale. I hope that answered the question to some extent.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Of course.
I have more, but I want to let someone else go. So I don't know how much time.
I'd love to schedule a meeting with you, Peter. We could talk about this for like 3 hours.
Yeah, I took a bunch of notes that I typed up, so I'll probably send them to you, just things for you to think about. But anyway.
I'd love for it. Thank you.
Other committee members?
All right. If Imad is, and Noreen, if you're not going to jump in, I have one that's sort of a background kind of big picture question, because you talk about, you frame this in terms of maybe we should be considering whether to implement machine learning and not always the how and the when. And I'm just curious if you have thoughts about why we don't consider whether to do it. So this is not really getting to the heart of what your project is about, but
it's like the coolest question ever. So I would say that a lot of it has to do with the fact that we get very enthusiastic about advancement. I think that being able to do certain things a certain way makes us excited to the extent that we don't want to consider the limitations of it. And that gets back to this idea of how the cognitive biases play into our decisions and how we choose to neglect certain portions of it. Now, yeah, it's such an interesting question, because I also think, and I mentioned that towards the end, that a lot of it has to do with incentive structures. A lot of it has to do with this idea that our economy is encouraging us to focus on the bottom line ahead of everything else. That is the main priority, I think. And so if you're a CEO and you're not focusing on the bottom line, you'll get fired. If you're considering the well-being of people as your primary priority, you will get fired. And so I think that a lot of our solutions to any problem, even beyond machine learning, have to do with the fact that we don't have incentive structures that encourage focus on human well-being or prioritize human well-being. And so I think that also plays into it, that we have to play by the rules. And I mean, the rules are just unfair, if we put it that way. And I think Noreen was saving herself for last because the advisor of the project was supposed to save herself for last.
Well, does Imad or
Actually, I just wanted to make a clarification that officially I'm not part of the committee. My name is there because I'm the chair of the department.
Right.
So I'll wait until you guys are done and then I can ask my question.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll keep giving Bardia a hard time then. All right. It's
Go
my
ahead,
job,
Peter.
right? Let's do it.
Go for it.
Okay, so let me see. Let me pick my next favorite one. Okay, so in the document, I have a lot of section numbers in my notes, but it won't
Sure.
mean a whole lot when I say them now. So there's some
Right.
sections in 4.4-ish, some of those subsections,
Mhm.
where you talk a fair bit about the distinction between whether something can only be accomplished with machine learning versus things that can't. And I didn't
Mhm.
carefully write up the terminology you used for this. I wonder a little bit about that though, and I didn't see sort of exactly where I'm supposed to fit that into the framework that you have here. So I don't know, is that sort of
So-
fall under interpretable models
Good.
or?
Yeah, so like I think that I think that what I was trying to get at, if I remember correctly, where 4.4 was, is how, regardless of whether we're capable to, whether we actually should. I think that's the distinction I was trying to make, because
I see.
we're able to do a lot of things really, really well with machine learning, but is it well enough? Is it considering the conditions? Is this something that we should find acceptable? What was the title of 4.4 specifically? Do you remember?
Yeah, all I have written down is 4.4.2.1 through 3. That's what I have written down, which is a lot of points. And so I don't know the exact. So I mean, I could tell you kind of the other part I have in here, which is at the time you were talking a little bit about the sort of unlocking your phone with your face example, which is one you brought up in your talk too.
Right.
And so I got to thinking about that, and like, here's one way I might, answer the question of like, should I implement facial recognition or not? Right. Well, some people tell me that it's biased. On the other hand, there's other ways to unlock your phone. Right. So that's sort of a naive, it's a naive, quick answer, right? I'm not saying whether it's right or whether it's wrong. But I wasn't exactly clear how that kind of fit into the model, right? I'm not sure what I should do with that information.
Yeah, so I could
On
address
a way,
that
it's
directly.
true, but it's also not fair, right?
So basically, if you look at the second step of the flow chart, it mentions non-machine learning alternatives.
Yeah.
So basically, what it's getting at there is that, and that's why, like, even if you go to the left on the first requirement of a life-defining need, if you have alternatives that are not related to machine learning, you'll still go to the right side of the flow chart, whereas if you don't have alternatives, you'll go to the left side of it. And so depending on, like if we look at, for instance, the facial recognition example with the phone, because I was low on time, I didn't mention that, but one more thing that I wanted to mention was, well, if you do have other options in opening your phone, then it isn't as big of an issue. Then you may choose to subject yourself to it, or you may choose not to. It's within your power to, abstain, if we put it that way. And so I think that part of the framework or flow chart addresses that it ensures that if you have alternatives beyond the solution that's proposed or proposed as the input, that's taken into account simply.
Okay, yeah, and I guess because even if it's done very poorly, right, you make your way down to accountability, and the company is likely to say, and of course, they should get all the pushback that they get, right, for if they do a poor job for certain groups of people.
Right.
But the impact on people's lives is perhaps small enough that the company can sort of hold them, they can be held accountable
Right, exactly.
for that to be
Because
impacted.
accountability is only relative to the amount of people that you're impacting. So
Yeah.
like even so in the presentation, and this is something that it's been interesting as I've been building this presentation that I've realized that I need to make some revisions to the actual thesis as well, is that I mentioned specifically that accountability shouldn't be applied to personal users, the people that are only using it for themselves. It's only applied to companies that are doing it on a large scale, or that are, selling it on a large scale, and companies that choose to make use of these algorithms on a large scale. But it could be within a person or a small organization's, it's within their freedom of choice to still deploy it if they personally, as a collective feel like, yeah, this is appropriate. So yeah.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I
Okay,
had one more, but
I'll jump in here now, because my question I think follows pretty well on to Bardia's. If you follow the leftmost branch on your flow chart, so
Sure.
there are no alternatives, and it's a black box model, you go straight to do not implement.
Yep.
And yet on an earlier slide, you said people may choose to use this method, even if it is a black box, because of its high performance. So I'm wondering if you somehow need to account for that.
Well, the thing is that these are situations in which, well, yeah, that's one thing that I've kind of addressed in the sense that, like not fully, but I've addressed it in the sense that I've made sure that if there are other alternatives, that's accommodated for. But it's just that what the point it's trying to get across here is that we should be prioritizing rationale ahead of performance in certain instances. That's left side of this flowchart has to do with the fact that we need a reason for accommodating certain portions of the world. Like for instance, when we consider a court case and you have some assessment tool that predicts way better than any human being on earth which people that are going to recidivate or recommit crimes when they get out. But it's just a black box algorithm that just gives you a number, but you don't know where that number came from. It's just directly related to the performance of the algorithm. And so performance without rationale in certain instances is of no use to us because of the fact that we rely on the intentions and we rely on the rationale in many portions or many facets of our society. And so that's what it's kind of trying to get at.
I think what you've just put your finger on is perhaps a refinement that you would need to make. In other words, you're saying if you're following that leftmost branch and you don't have an alternative, you've got a black box model, you have to ask the question, are you imposing this model or the results of this model on other people? Or are you choosing to accept the results merely for yourself?
That's a really good addition.
Because
100%.
if you may, as you gave the example of the cancer patient, decide to accept the results of that black box model because of its high performance.
Right.
As long as you are free to make that choice, you're good. So
right.
I think I would add a freedom of choice box in there that says, is this being imposed upon me? In which case, I'm pretty scared about not understanding why that black box is making the decision it's making. Or do I have the freedom to say, yes, but I'm going to accept its track record and go with it?
Yeah, I think that's a great addition because I've been, so isolated and been thinking about this, introspectively a lot. When I was considering, for instance, the cancer patient scenario, I was assuming that there would be another alternative at hand, that you would always go to the right side of the chart, whereas
but there might not be.
Yeah, which may not necessarily be the case. If we proceed in this direction where we consistently rely on technology to do the work, it may be that we automate a lot of these processes to the extent that there is no other alternative. So
Yeah.
I will definitely add that. Thank you.
Okay, we've got about 5 more minutes before the committee has to talk. So are there other people who are not on the committee who have a question they would like to ask?
That would be me. Okay, Bardia, I'm going to ask more of a general question, not directly related to your work, but sort of more of a broader educational question. There's 2 parts. First of all, I want to hear a bit from you about where do you feel our curriculum, and I'm not talking about computer science, I'm talking about the CSP SGU curriculum, you felt that you became more prepared to engage in a research project like this. You know, I love the work that you're doing, but I've always been more on the technical side. And a lot of our students are also there. So the second part of my question would be, do you think we in computer science are doing a good job preparing students to be asking those tough questions?
Well, thank you for both questions. I would say that by virtue of being on a liberal arts campus or being in a liberal arts institution, we're encouraged to think about things beyond the, you know, the performance and the beyond the aspect of the actual field. And I think that the fact that I was encouraged to take a philosophy class or like a humanities class, thank you, Dr. Desjardins, for that one. That was one of my favorite classes in college. Those types of encouragements or those types of requirements have made me more interested about these types of things. And then the other thing is, I think that from the moment I started my college journey, I was looking for something that would allow me to be interdisciplinary, something that allowed me to exercise my skills in multiple fields. Integrative science is a great major for that. I felt like numerical computation, which is my current major, was great for that as well. I think that in that regard, I think pushing people to do more interdisciplinary majors is one way to address that. But if we look at the computer science department itself, I think they do a great job. I think that when it comes to the ethics class that everyone has to take, that one covers a lot. A lot of the professors, including you, Peter, consciously try to include that as part of each course. I mean, as part of Peter's class, we had a discussion about these types of things every week, even though it wasn't necessarily the main topic of the course. So I think that liberal arts institutions in particular, but also the computer science department is going above and beyond. But if you want my specific feedback on these types of things, I'd love to provide it.
Okay.